It is the first week of July.
In the year 1776, and the windows of a red brick building in Philadelphia are closed. Outside, it is one of the hottest summers anyone can remember. Inside, the windows stay shut anyway. What is being said in this room cannot be allowed to carry into the street. There are fewer than 60 men here. Most of them are wealthy. Almost all of them have something to lose. And they are about to put their names to a single sheet of paper that the moment the ink dries will make every one of them a traitor to the most powerful empire on earth. The punishment for what they are doing is not prison, it is death. In the language of the time, treason against the crown could be answered with the rope, and with worse. Their king has already declared them to be in rebellion. Now they are answering him in writing. The paper does not describe a country that exists. There is no country yet. There is no army worth the name, no treasury, no navy, no capital, no agreement on what any of it should look like. There are 13 colonies that do not entirely trust one another, strung along the edge of a continent they have barely mapped. What the paper does is stranger than a declaration of war. It is a declaration of existence. It says that a nation is now here, because these men have said so. Near the top, in a single sentence, it makes a claim that no government in history had ever placed at its own foundation. That all men are created equal. That they carry rights no king can grant and no king can take away. And that when a government fails to protect those rights, the people may abolish it and begin again. Not one of the men in that room fully lived by those words. Many of them owned other human beings. The sentence claimed far more than its authors were willing to mean. And still, they signed. In the final line, they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to a sentence. 250 years later, that sheet of paper is still here. It sits in a sealed case in Washington, its ink now faded almost to nothing. And the argument it began, the argument over what its words actually mean and who they actually include, has never once stopped. This is the United States, a country that, almost alone among the nations of the earth, was not born from a shared bloodline or an ancient homeland, but was written into being. A country made, in the most literal sense, of an idea. And to understand it, you have to follow that idea across a continent and across the 2.5 centuries of people who took it far more seriously than the men who wrote it ever intended. To see how quickly an idea could become something physical, go to a small green square at the southern tip of Manhattan. Today, it is ringed by the glass towers of the financial district. In 1776, it held a statue. The statue was gilded lead, larger than life, and it showed King George III on horseback in the pose of a Roman emperor. It had stood there for 6 years, at the center of a place called Bowling Green, as a daily reminder of who ruled and who did not. On the 9th of July, 1776, the Declaration was read aloud to General Washington's troops in the city for the first time. The words traveled north from Philadelphia and were spoken into the summer air in front of thousands of soldiers and citizens. That same night, a crowd went to Bowling Green, threw ropes around the king, and pulled him to the ground. Then they did something with him. The lead of the statue, some 4,000 pounds of it, was loaded onto carts, carried up into Connecticut, and melted. Out of the king's own image, the colonists cast more than 42,000 musket balls, ammunition to be fired back at the king's own soldiers. The head was cut off first and smuggled away, and eventually shipped across the ocean toward London. It was never seen again. There is something almost unbearably direct about it. A set of words was read out loud, and within hours, a crowd had turned the symbol of the old world into the raw material of the new one. This is what it looks like when a country declares itself into existence. Not a ceremony, a sentence, and then a nation of people deciding to act as though the sentence were already true. But here is the part most people miss. When those words were written, they did not mean what we now think they meant. When Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, he was not in that moment describing a promise of individual equality for every person alive. Historians who have studied the language closely point out that in 1776, the sentence was making a narrower argument. It was saying that the American colonists, as a people, had the same right to govern themselves as any other people on Earth. It was a claim about nations, not about individuals. And then something happened that the authors did not plan. The words got loose. Each generation that came after read them a little more broadly than the one before. People the founders never had in mind: the enslaved, women, the immigrant, the native nations, the poor, picked up that sentence and said, if the words are true, then they are true for us as well. The whole history of the United States can be read as a 250-year argument over a single sentence, not whether to keep it, but how far it reaches. The sentence was only the beginning of the experiment. Declaring a nation into being was one thing. Building a government that could actually hold it together without a king was another thing entirely. And at first, the country nearly failed at it. The first system it tried, a loose agreement among the states, proved far too weak to function, and within a few years, the whole project was close to falling apart. So, in 1787, in that same Philadelphia hall, a second group of men sat down to try again. What they wrote this time was a constitution, a set of rules for how the country would govern itself, and it opened with 3 words that carried the whole idea forward. We the people. Not the king, not the state, the people. Built into that system was an idea so ordinary to us now that it is easy to miss how radical it was then. Power would change hands peacefully on a fixed schedule by counting. The Constitution required the country to count itself every 10 years in a national census, so that representation could be shared out fairly as the population moved and grew. The first count came in 1790. It has been carried out every decade since, in war and in peace, without a single interruption. A country that could agree on very little at least agreed on this: that it would keep counting itself and keep handing power to whoever the count and the vote produced. Before it was any of that, though, it was land. And the land is far older than the argument. Cut down into the earth of northern Arizona, and you can read the age directly. The Grand Canyon is a mile deep, and its walls are a stack of time. The rock at the very bottom is close to 2 billion years old, laid down, buried, lifted, and then slowly carved away by a single river over the last few million years. Standing on the rim, a human lifetime does not register. Even the whole story of the country, all 2.5 centuries of it, is a thin, bright line near the very top of the wall. Each colored band below it marks an ocean that came and went, or a desert that rose and was buried. Whole vanished worlds stacked one on top of another. Against that depth of time, the entire life of the country is very young indeed. The country that would eventually claim this canyon stretches across an entire temperate band of the planet. It runs from the granite spine of the Appalachians in the east, mountains so old they had already been worn down before the Atlantic Ocean finished opening, to the young, sharp peaks of the Rockies in the west. It holds the lowest, hottest ground in North America, in a place aptly named Death Valley, where the summer air has reached the highest temperature ever reliably recorded on the surface of the Earth. And it holds the highest point on the continent, the peak the Koyukon people called Denali, the high one, far to the north in Alaska. Down its middle runs the Mississippi, a river that drains a basin reaching from the Rockies to the Appalachians, gathering the water of nearly half the country and carrying it to the Gulf. It was this river system, more than any law, that made a continental nation physically possible. Move goods and people along the water, and a scattering of settlements on the eastern seaboard can slowly become something that spans a continent. To the north, along the border with Canada, sits the largest system of fresh surface water on the planet, the Great Lakes, 5 inland seas that together hold roughly a fifth of all the liquid fresh water on Earth. They were carved by ice, gouged out by glaciers more than a kilometer thick that ground their way south and then melted back, leaving behind basins so large that from their shores you cannot see the far side, only water meeting sky. The country that grew up around them would build much of its early industry along those shores, moving iron and grain across water that behaves less like a lake and more like an inland ocean, with storms and waves to match. For the first years of its life, the new country was small, pinned to the Atlantic coast. Then, in 1803, it doubled in a single stroke. France, under Napoleon, needed money and no longer wanted its enormous claim in the middle of the continent. The United States bought it. Overnight, on paper, the country grew by more than 800,000 square miles, an area larger than all of Western Europe, for around $15 million, a few cents an acre. But the land was not empty. It had never been empty. It held nations: the Lakota, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, the Osage, hundreds of distinct peoples with their own languages, territories, and histories, many of them older than any European state. The document signed in Philadelphia had spoken of governments deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Across the width of the continent, that principle was quietly set aside. The people already living on the land were not asked for their consent. What followed was framed, at the time, as destiny. The idea even carried a name: manifest destiny, the belief that the country was somehow meant to stretch from one ocean to the other. And it did stretch, but the stretching was not weather. It was done to specific people, by specific people, and it carries a specific weight. In 1838, in the southeast, the army arrives to carry out a removal that has been ordered by law. 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children are forced from their homes and marched more than 1,000 miles to the west, through the cold, into territory they have never seen. Thousands die along the way. The Cherokee would remember it, in their own language, as the trail where they cried. They were not the only nation moved this way, and the land they were moved onto would, in time, be taken from them again. On those plains, the native nations had lived alongside an animal that shaped almost everything about their world: the American bison. In the early 1700s, before all of this, there may have been 30 million of them, in herds so vast that observers described the prairie itself as appearing to move. A grown bull can weigh a full ton, stand almost 2 meters at the shoulder, and run at more than 50 kilometers an hour. For the peoples of the plains, the bison was food, shelter, tool, and clothing, and it was woven deep into their ceremonies and their sense of the sacred. By the end of the 1800s, there were fewer than 1,000 left alive. The near-total destruction of the bison was not simply an accident of hunting. It was, in part, deliberate. Officials understood that the plains nations depended on the herds, and that to break the herds was to break the people. And so the animals were shot from passing trains, stripped for their hides, and left in heaps to rot, until a species that had numbered in the tens of millions was very nearly gone, and the human nations that depended on it were forced onto reservations. That the bison exists at all today is the result of a last-moment reversal. A handful of ranchers and early conservationists gathered up the few survivors. Slowly, in protected places like Yellowstone, the herds began to return. Today, the animal is the official national mammal of the United States. It survived the century that had been designed, in effect, to end it. But it survives as a remnant of what was once one of the largest gatherings of large animals anywhere on Earth. The bison shares that grassland with an animal that carries an even stranger story inside its own body: the pronghorn. It looks a little like an antelope, though it is not one. It is the last survivor of a family of animals found nowhere else on Earth, and it can run at nearly 100 kilometers an hour, faster over distance than almost anything else alive on the continent. Which raises a simple question. Nothing in North America today is fast enough to make a pronghorn need that speed. No wolf, no cougar comes anywhere close. So why can it run like that? The answer is that it is running from a ghost. Tens of thousands of years ago, these plains held a predator that could match it: an American cheetah, long since extinct. The pronghorn evolved its speed to escape a hunter that no longer exists. The cheetah vanished at the end of the last ice age. The pronghorn kept running. It is built, to this day, to outrun something that has been gone for 12,000 years. A living memory, carried in muscle and bone, of a world that has already ended. What finally bound the continent together and finished off the open range these animals had roamed was iron. In 1869, 2 railroad lines, one building east from California, the other building west from the plains, met in the desert of Utah and were joined with a single ceremonial spike. For the first time, a person could cross the entire width of the country in a matter of days rather than months. It changed everything. Goods, people, mail, and news could suddenly move from coast to coast at the speed of a machine, and the far side of the continent stopped being a distant frontier and started becoming part of a single, connected country. The line was built largely by hand and largely by immigrants. Thousands of Chinese laborers cut and blasted the track through the hardest mountains in the West in brutal and often deadly conditions for lower pay than others received, and were then written almost entirely out of the celebration once the work was finished. Within a few short years, the same country whose railroads they had built would pass that law barring Chinese immigrants by name. The tracks they laid helped bind the nation together. The nation, in turn, told them they did not belong. It was the same contradiction, running straight down the middle of the same steel rails. To sit with the deepest contradiction in the country's founding, you have to leave the plains and go back east to a mountaintop in Virginia. At the top of that mountain stands a house called Monticello, elegant and famous, designed and redesigned by its owner across decades. Its owner was Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote that all men are created equal. That house was built and run by people he owned. Over the course of his life, Thomas Jefferson enslaved more than 600 human beings. At the very moment he was writing the sentence that would one day be used to end slavery, he was living off the labor of the enslaved, and he continued to do so until the day he died. He wrote about liberty in a study kept clean by people who had none of it. He seems to have known the contradiction. In an early draft of the Declaration, Jefferson had included a passage condemning the slave trade. The other delegates struck it out. The new country was not willing to begin by confronting the one thing that most plainly broke its own central claim. And there was at least one man, in Jefferson's own time, who told him so directly. His name was Benjamin Banneker. He was a free black man, born in Maryland in 1731, largely self-taught, and one of the finest astronomers and mathematicians in the country. He could calculate the movements of the stars accurately enough to predict an eclipse. He helped survey the land that would become the nation's capital. And he published almanacs, the kind of practical yearly books that farmers relied on, filled with tide tables, weather, and the timing of the natural world. Among the things Banneker observed and recorded were the insects that rose out of the ground around him in enormous numbers on a schedule, and then vanished for years at a time. He was watching one of the most peculiar creatures in all of North America, the periodical cicada. These cicadas are found only in the eastern part of the continent, nowhere else on Earth, and they keep time in a way almost nothing else alive does. They spend either 13 or 17 years underground as juveniles, feeding in darkness on the sap of tree roots. Then, in a single spring, triggered by the warmth of the soil, an entire generation climbs out of the earth at once, sometimes more than 1 million of them in a single acre, filling the forest with a solid wall of sound. The numbers 13 and 17 are not random. They are both prime numbers, divisible only by themselves and by 1. The leading explanation is that a prime-numbered life cycle is very hard for any predator to fall into step with. A hunter that peaks every 2 or 3 or 5 years will almost never have its own boom line up with the cicada's rare emergence. By keeping time in prime numbers, the cicada slips between the cycles of nearly everything that would eat it. It has, in effect, hidden itself inside mathematics. The 13-year and the 17-year broods fall into step with each other only once every 221 years. Banneker watched these creatures rise and counted the years between them, and in 1791 he did something that took a very different kind of courage. He wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson. In it, he laid out the plain contradiction. He quoted Jefferson's own words back to him, that all men are created equal, and pointed out that Jefferson held people in bondage while professing to believe it. He asked the author of the sentence to live up to the sentence. Jefferson wrote back. He was polite. He praised Banneker's work, and then he did nothing at all. The contradictions stood. In the end, it would take a war to break it. Not every idea the country produced was broken in the keeping. Some of them it genuinely gave to the world. In 1872, the United States did something no nation had done before. It took a vast area of wilderness in the northern Rockies, a place of geysers and hot springs and deep canyons, and it set that land aside by law, permanently, for no one to own, to be kept, in the words of the Act, for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. It was called Yellowstone, and it was the first national park anywhere on Earth. The idea that a country might protect a piece of nature not because it was useful, but simply because it was worth keeping, spread from there to almost every nation in the world. It was, in its own way, another act of declaration, a decision that some things belong to everyone and to no one. Yellowstone sits on top of something enormous. Beneath its colored pools and its steaming ground lies one of the largest active volcanic systems on the planet, a chamber of molten rock so vast that the whole park is essentially the roof of a sleeping supervolcano. The same forces that make the ground beautiful also make it dangerous. And on that ground, the bison never fully disappeared. Yellowstone is the one place in the country where wild bison have lived continuously since before the nation existed, a single, unbroken thread of the old plains. There is another idea the country came to stand for, one that is not written in the Declaration at all, but which grew up around it. The idea that a person could arrive from almost anywhere and become an American, that the nation might be defined not by ancestry, but by joining. In the harbor of New York stands the clearest expression of it. The Statue of Liberty was a gift from France, raised in 1886, a copper woman more than 90 meters tall from the base of her pedestal to the tip of her torch. On a plaque inside is a poem written by Emma Lazarus that gave the statue much of its meaning. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. For the millions who came, the first American ground they touched was often a small island just beyond the statue, Ellis Island. Between 1892 and 1954, more than 12 million immigrants passed through its halls, were inspected, questioned, sometimes renamed, and then either admitted or turned away. A very large share of the country now alive can trace a line back through that one building. It was never simple, and it was never fully open. The same country that raised the statue also, in 1882, passed a law specifically to bar Chinese immigrants, the first time it had ever excluded a group by name. Native Americans, who had been here longest of all, were not guaranteed citizenship across the whole country until 1924. The sentence about equality kept running up against the same hard question of who counted as one of the people. The promise and the limit arrived together again and again. And yet, for all of those limits, the country was doing something almost no other nation on earth was built to do. It was allowing people to choose it. In most of the world, for most of history, your nation was simply the one you were born into, decided entirely by ancestry and by soil. But a country made of an idea can, in principle, be joined by anyone willing to take the idea on. To this day, people arrive from every corner of the planet, learn the country's history and its founding words, and then stand together in a room to swear an oath. At the end of that oath, they are as fully American as anyone whose family has been here for centuries. Citizenship by belief rather than by blood. It was, and it remains, one of the strangest and most powerful things the sentence made possible. The country the immigrants entered was not one place, but many, stitched together. In the far southeast, the solid land gives way to water, and the water gives way to something in between. The Everglades in southern Florida is not quite a swamp and not quite a river. It is a sheet of fresh water, 100 kilometers wide and only inches deep in places, moving so slowly toward the sea that it can take months for a single flow to finish its journey. The people who first knew it described it, in effect, as a river of grass, and in that warm, shallow world lives an animal older than almost anything around it. The American alligator is a survivor out of deep time, a design that has changed very little in tens of millions of years. It can grow past 4 meters, wait motionless for hours, and pass through the coldest months barely moving at all. For much of the last century, it was hunted so heavily for its hide that it nearly vanished from the wild. Then the country changed its mind. Under a law passed in 1973, the Endangered Species Act, the alligator was protected, and it recovered so completely that today it is once again a common sight across the southern wetlands. It is one of the clearest cases of a species pulled back from the very edge by a deliberate decision. The same law that saved the alligator saved others. On the Channel Islands off California, a small fox, found nowhere else on Earth, fell to just a few dozen animals and was brought back within a single generation. Again and again, the country nearly lost a piece of its own living world and then chose in time to keep it. Move west from those wetlands and the land dries out completely into the deserts of the Southwest, where survival is written into everything that manages to live. In the Sonoran Desert stands a plant that has become a kind of shorthand for the whole American West, the giant saguaro cactus. It grows almost impossibly slowly. In its first 10 years, it may reach only a few centimeters. It can take 50 years or more before it grows its very first arm, and the tallest of them, well over a century old, stand as high as a building, holding tons of water inside their pleated trunks against the years when almost no rain comes. A saguaro standing in the desert today may have been a seedling before the Civil War. Among its roots lives one of the only venomous lizards on Earth, the Gila monster, a slow, heavy, black and orange animal found almost nowhere outside this one corner of the continent. It spends most of its life underground, out of the killing heat, surfacing only rarely. It can go months between meals, living off the fat stored in its own tail. Everything in this desert is built like the pronghorn, like the saguaro, to outlast a world that is quietly trying to kill it. The country kept absorbing places that had been something else first. In the middle of the Pacific, more than 3,000 kilometers from the mainland, the islands of Hawaii were an independent kingdom with their own monarchs before they were annexed and eventually made a state. On the island of Hawaii, the volcano Kilauea still adds new land to the country in slow rivers of lava that harden into black rock at the water's edge. A nation still, quite literally, growing. Alaska, in the far north, was bought from Russia in 1867 for around $7 million, a purchase mocked at the time as folly until gold, and then oil, and then sheer strategic value proved otherwise. It nearly doubled the size of the country again, this time with mountains, tundra, and the largest gathering of bald eagles anywhere on Earth. And in pockets across the whole country, older worlds went on living inside the new one. In New Orleans, French and Spanish and West African and Caribbean threads braided together into something that existed nowhere else, in the food, in the music, in the language of the streets. The country's oldest habit was to swallow difference, and then slowly to be changed by what it had swallowed. And sometimes the country was reshaped from the inside by its own people simply moving. Across the first half of the 20th century, some 6 million Black Americans left the rural South, where the promise of that second founding had been so thoroughly denied, and moved north and west into the cities. It was one of the largest internal migrations in the country's history, and it remade those cities completely. Out of that movement and that mixing came the sound that most of the world now hears when it thinks of America. In the clubs of New Orleans and then Chicago and then New York, musicians took European instruments, West African rhythm, and the blues that had grown up in the fields of the South and made something genuinely new out of the combination: jazz. It was the country in miniature. Many separate traditions forced together by history, producing something that none of them could have made alone, and something that could only have come from here. Across the interior, a different kind of national character formed around movement. This was a country built for going, first by river, then by rail, then by a web of highways so vast that it reshaped daily life itself, until the simple ability to get into a vehicle and drive 1,000 miles became almost a birthright. On the western edge, up the coast of California, stand the tallest living things on the planet: the coast redwoods, some of them older than the Declaration by more than 1,000 years, trees that were already ancient when the first words of the country were written. And through the center of the country runs a corridor where warm air off the Gulf collides with cold air pouring down from the north to produce more tornadoes than anywhere else on Earth. A land that is, in almost every sense, a place of extremes held inside a single border. But all of it, the land, the wildlife, the wonders, sits on top of the unfinished argument. And by the middle of the 1800s, that argument could no longer be avoided. The country had been declared into existence on the claim that all men are created equal, and it held at that very same time some 4 million human beings in slavery. Those two facts could not both stand forever. The sentence and the institution were on a collision course, and almost everyone could feel it coming. In 1852, a man was asked to give a speech for the 4th of July in Rochester, New York. His name was Frederick Douglass. He had been born into slavery in Maryland, had taught himself to read in secret, and had escaped to freedom in 1838. By this point, he was one of the most powerful speakers in the entire country. He stood in front of a crowd gathered to celebrate the nation's independence, and he asked them a question. What, to the enslaved, is your 4th of July? He did not throw out the founders. He called their principles saving principles, and he told the crowd to hold to them at all costs. But then he turned. This day, he told them, was theirs, not his. The blessings they were celebrating were not shared. To the millions still in chains, the bright sunlight of that anniversary revealed only the immense distance between the promise and their own lives. He was doing exactly what Banneker had done 60 years before, and what generation after generation would keep on doing. He was holding the country to its own sentence. He was saying, "You wrote the words, now mean them." And within a decade, the country tore itself apart over precisely that question. The war that came, beginning in 1861, was the deadliest the nation has ever fought, before or since. It was fought over whether a country half slave and half free could go on existing at all, and it killed, by recent estimates, more than 700,000 people, more Americans than would die in both world wars combined. Whole towns lost an entire generation of their young men. The country very nearly ended, only 80 and some years after it had begun. In the middle of that war, on a battlefield in Pennsylvania, where tens of thousands had just fallen, the president stood up to speak, and he spoke for barely 2 minutes. It is November 1863. Abraham Lincoln stands at Gettysburg, above the fresh graves, and he reaches back, not to the Constitution, not to any statute, but to the sentence. 87 years ago, he begins. 87 years, which points not to the founding of the government, but back to 1776 and the Declaration. He speaks of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And he tells the exhausted country that the war is a test of whether a nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. In those 2 minutes, Lincoln did something quiet and enormous. He took the sentence that Jefferson had written in one meaning, and that Banneker and Douglas had pushed toward a fuller one, and he made that fuller meaning the entire point of the country. He refounded the nation on its own words, not the country as it had actually been, the country as the sentence had always said it should be. When the war ended, the country wrote that fuller meaning into its highest law. 3 amendments, passed in the years that followed, abolished slavery, promised equal protection under the law to every person, and extended the vote regardless of race. Historians sometimes call it the second founding. It was the sentence, finally, being taken at its word, at a cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. And even then, the sentence did not reach everyone. Those amendments extended the vote regardless of race. They said nothing at all about sex. Half the country was still standing outside the words. It was an old omission. Back in 1776, as her husband John helped to build the new government, Abigail Adams had written to him with a plain request. "Remember the ladies," she told him, "and do not put unlimited power into the hands of husbands." He answered lightly, and the founders moved on. Women were simply not part of the equal that the sentence was understood to mean. So women began doing exactly what Banneker and Douglas had done before them. In 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York, a gathering of women wrote a declaration of their own, deliberately modeled on the first one, changing only a handful of words. All men and women, they wrote, are created equal. It would take another 72 years of argument, of marching, and of arrest before the country amended its own law in 1920 to guarantee women the vote. The sentence was made to stretch again over the loud objections of people who insisted it had never been meant to stretch that far. But writing a meaning into law is not the same thing as living by it. For nearly 100 years after that second founding, much of the country found ways to hollow it out. In the South especially, the promise of equal protection was answered with segregation, with laws that separated people by race in almost every part of daily life, and with violence used to keep Black Americans from voting at all. The words were there on the page. On the ground, they were denied. And so the argument came around once more, in the middle of the 20th century, carried this time by a movement. In 1963, before an immense crowd in Washington, a minister named Martin Luther King Jr. stood in front of the memorial to Lincoln and framed the whole struggle in the country's own terms. He said that the founders had signed a promissory note, a promise written into the Declaration and the Constitution to which every American was meant to fall heir. And he said that for millions of citizens, that note had come back marked insufficient funds. He had come, he said, to cash it. It was Banneker's move again, and Douglas's, and Lincoln's. The very same move made a fourth time, and a fifth. You wrote the words. Now mean them, for us as well. In the years that followed, new laws finally struck down legal segregation and protected the right to vote. The sentence pushed, once again, to reach further than it ever had before. Which brings the long argument to the present and to a particular date. In the year 2026, the country marks 250 years since that sheet of paper was signed in Philadelphia. It is a nation of around 350 million people now, the third most populous on Earth, spread across a continent and beyond it, more varied in its origins than at any point in its history. Among its youngest citizens, no single group forms a majority. The country of the immigrants has become more and more a country of everyone. And the old question, who counts as one of the people, is at this very moment being argued as fiercely as it has been in generations. As the 250th anniversary arrives, immigration into the country has fallen sharply, dropping by government estimate from its recent peak to a small fraction of it within just a few years. The rules of who may come, who may stay, and even who may be a citizen by birth are being contested in public and in the courts. The nation that placed a poem about huddled masses on a statue in its largest harbor is, at the same moment, arguing about how many people it will let in and on what terms. Both things are true at once, exactly as they have always been true at once. This is not new. It is the oldest thing about the country. A nation made of a sentence has to decide over and over in every single generation what the sentence means and who it holds. There is one more animal to return to, the one the country chose at the very beginning to stand for itself. In 1782, 6 years after the Declaration, the new nation chose the bald eagle as its emblem. It is a large bird of prey with a wingspan approaching 2.5 meters, found across the continent and in its greatest numbers in Alaska. It is not actually bald. The name comes from an older meaning of the word, describing the white feathers that cover its head. For 2 centuries, it appeared on the country's seal, on its coins, on its documents, the symbol of the nation stamped onto the nation's own paper. And in the middle of the 20th century, the country very nearly killed it. A pesticide called DDT, sprayed widely across the land, worked its way up through the food chain and into the eagles, thinning the shells of their eggs until they cracked under the weight of the parents. The population collapsed. By the 1960s, in the lower states, only a few hundred breeding pairs remained. The bird on the nation's seal was disappearing from the nation's own sky. Then, once again, the country changed course. It banned the pesticide. It protected the bird under the same law that had saved the alligator. And slowly, across decades, the eagle recovered, until in 2007, it was removed from the endangered list entirely. Today, they are a common sight again along rivers and coastlines, the recovered symbol of a country that has a long, hard habit of nearly destroying the very things it claims to hold sacred. And then, at the last possible moment, choosing to save them. It is difficult not to see the whole country inside that one bird, chosen to stand for an ideal, very nearly lost through the nation's own carelessness, and then brought back, not by accident, but by a deliberate decision to live up to what it was supposed to mean. The sentence itself is still here. If you go to Washington, to the National Archives, you can stand in front of the original Declaration of Independence, the actual sheet that was signed in that closed room in 1776. It is not easy to read anymore. 2.5 centuries of light and handling have faded the ink until much of it is only a ghost of itself. The signatures at the bottom, the names of the men who pledged their lives to it, are pale shadows now. The document that called a nation into being is, physically, quietly, disappearing. It rests in a sealed case, in low light, under guard, protected as carefully as anything the country owns. And this, in the end, may be the truest thing about the United States. It is a country that keeps, at its very center, not a crown, not a bloodline, not an ancient stone, but a piece of paper with a sentence on it, a sentence that its own author did not fully mean, a sentence that has had to be fought over, expanded, and paid for in blood again and again for 250 years. A country made of an idea is a strange and fragile thing. It is not held together by the simple fact of having always existed the way older nations are. It exists only for as long as each new generation decides that the words are still worth meaning. The founders declared it into being once, but the declaring never actually finished. Every generation since has had to declare it again, to decide, in its own time, who the sentence includes. On its 250th birthday, the country is doing what it has always done, celebrating the words and arguing about them, standing in the harbor with a torch and a poem, and standing at the border with a set of hard questions at the very same time. No one knows what the next generation will decide the sentence means, whether it will reach further, as it has so often before, or whether for a time it will pull back. That was never settled in Philadelphia. It was only begun there. The paper is fading in its case, and what the words are actually worth is still today being decided by the people who choose to live by them. Thanks for watching. Until the next journey.